This is East Asia Tonight.
Good evening, I'm Atelia Edwards. Tonight's top stories from East Asia. The US and China extend their trade truce by another 90 days, giving themselves until November to work out differences over duties. The markets rise as investor optimism gets a boost from the extension, and President Donald Trump's willingness to let US companies resume some chip sales to China. Meantime, Beijing pledges millions of dollars for the Pacific island nation of Nauru, prompting Washington to promise its own contributions. We look into why China and the U.S. are pushing for influence. And South Korea waiting for a court ruling on a request to arrest its former First Lady. If granted, she will make history as the first in her role to be taken into custody. Also in East Asia tonight, adverse weather affects parts of the region. Torrential rains are drenching Japan's Kyushu region, while Taiwanese officials issue sea warnings as Typhoon Podul approaches. And Japan marks 40 years since the crash of a jumbo jet that claimed more than 500 lives, the world's deadliest single aircraft accident. A brief lull to the trade row between the U.S. and China, as both agreed to extend the truce by 90 days. The move continues a reprieve from an escalating tit-for-tat trade war that roiled global markets earlier this year. Now, U.S. President Donald Trump signed an executive order to extend the tariff pause to 10th of November, shortly before the deadline was due to expire overnight. Washington and Beijing have agreed to uphold a deal, staving off what could have been triple-digit tariffs on each other's goods. For now, U.S. tariffs on Chinese goods stand at 30%, while Beijing will maintain a 10% levy on American shipments. Washington wants to allow for more negotiations on, quote, remedying trade imbalances, with the White House citing a trade deficit of nearly $300 billion with China last year. Meanwhile, Beijing is holding out hope that Washington will get rid of what it calls unreasonable trade barriers. Now, Chinese and U.S. delegations have held back-to-back trade negotiations in the lead-up to the extension. Talks in Geneva saw the two nations reach a landmark deal to impose a 90-day pause on the steep tariffs. Subsequent discussions in London raised issues around Chinese rare earth shipments to the U.S. And the latest round in Stockholm yielding no real breakthroughs, although the U.S. Treasury Secretary said he remains optimistic about the path forward. Well, the extension, observers say, gives the two countries more time to work out their trade differences. If a deal is reached before the next deadline, it could pave the way for a summit between the nations' leaders. China and Brazil are reinforcing ties against the backdrop of the Trump administration's tariff policies. Chinese President Xi Jinping says that the two nations should work together to set an example of, quote, self-reliance for the global south. Mr. Xi made the remark in a one-hour-long phone call at the request of Brazilian President Luiz Inacio da Silva. Tuesday's discussion also saw leaders agreeing on the role of G20 and BRICS in defending multilateralism and combating climate change. The two sides also highlighted their commitment to expand cooperation in potential business ventures. Now, according to state media, Mr. Xi also called on countries to unite and firmly oppose unilateralism and protectionism, in a veiled reference to Washington's tariff regime. China and Brazil have sought to present their countries as defenders of the multilateral trading system in recent months. Last week, the Trump administration imposed a 50% tariff on a whole range of Brazilian exports to the U.S. Mr. Lula had also indicated plans to speak with the leaders of China and India to consider a coordinated response to U.S. tariffs. And for more on this, CNA's Deborah Wang, she joins us now from Shenzhen. So, Deborah, looking at U.S.-China relations, apart from this temporary reprieve from tit-for-tat tariffs, what else is on the negotiating table?
So it's very clear that this 90-day extension will essentially buy negotiators more time to go back and reset and look at how they can address fundamental issues. And we're talking about U.S. curbs of sales, of high-tech products to China, as well as China's purchase of Russian oil. Now, on that front, you know that the U.S. has not backed down on sanctioning buyers of Russian oil. We know that it slapped 25% tariffs on India last week. But the U.S. also does know that talks with China is a little bit more complicated. They have to approach this delicately. So that's going to influence the negotiations at some point. Now, the U.S. is also hoping to remedy trade imbalances, as we've seen from the statement coming out of the White House. Earlier this week, we've heard Trump urging China to increase its purchase of U.S. soybeans. But, it is harvest season now in the U.S. However, China has not committed to buying soybeans from the U.S. at the moment. In fact, China is the world's largest buyer of soybeans. And in the past year, we've seen them switch to buying more soybeans from Brazil, its BRICS partner. And now we're seeing, trade volume strengthen between China and its political allies. It's also a move that has caused the U.S. to be a lot more uncomfortable. In fact, hours after the truce extension was announced, Brazilian President Lula told Xi Jinping that he was concerned about Brazil's own U.S. trade measures. In fact, both China and Brazil during that phone call, agreed to maintain a very stable trade relationship. But despite any of the global tariffs that are happening, the U.S. had slapped 50% of tariffs on Brazilian exports on August 1st to punish Brazil for what it's seeing as anti-American policies of the BRICS bloc. So even if the talks are just between U.S. and China, how both superpowers respond or handle their relationship with their respective allies will definitely influence any, tariff talks in the next 90 days.
Also, Deborah, in terms of U.S.-China relations, you'd say that this tariff extension is seen as critical, do you?
Yes, we are seeing both sides actually shy away from the hard topics like Russian oil purchase. At the moment, does seem quite likely that both sides are paving the way for a potential Trump-Xi meeting. In fact, Trump last week hinted that he wanted to see a meeting be held before the end of this year. Both leaders have already confirmed that they will be attending the ASEAN summit that is going to be happening at the end of October. Another possibility is also the APEC Leaders Summit that's going to be happening a few days after the ASEAN Summit. We are scrutinizing these dates very carefully because they are also going to be coming before the next truce expires on November. Now, the tariff extension is important because essentially what it does is to create a space for both sides to set aside very aggressive trade practices, trade tactics that we've seen at the start of this year. The talks so far in Geneva, London and Stockholm have sort of inched things along. We see tariffs come down from three-digit figures, and we also see some of them roll back countermeasures. China is reviewing quicker approvals for rare earth exports to the U.S., and we're also seeing the resumption of Nvidia chips to China. So although there's still renewed calls from China to the U.S. to tell them to approach any trade agreements respectfully, we are seeing political messaging geared towards reconciliation. Back to you.
Good to know. Thanks so very much for your insights there. CNA's Deborah Wang live from Shenzhen. And we've got Roland Lin standing by now with a roundup of market reaction to the U.S.-China trade developments. So, Roland, the extension of the tariff truce, it's helping to cushion investor sentiment. Is that right?
Yes, definitely, Oteli. Even though the decision was widely expected, well, the relief has been quite evident, I would say. Let's take a look at China's main indices holding steady on the extended trade truce with the U.S. Quick check. In Hong Kong, the Hang Seng Index currently up 0.25%. Shanghai Composite closing out today 0.5% higher. And Shenzhen also by about the same margin, 11,351 points. 30-year bond yields, well, that rose to its highest since April as the truce extension spurs hopes of better trade ties between the world's two biggest economies. Soybean prices falling back below $10 a bushel after news of an extended U.S.-China trade truce. Contracts for November delivery, well, that dropped 1.1%. That's a turnaround from yesterday's 2.4% rise. Now, prices had risen in anticipation of potential purchases following President Trump's plea for more Chinese buying. Now, traders seeing the truce extension as likely delaying major grain purchasing deals between the nations until late this year. Remember, China is the world's top buyer of oilseed and usually ranks as the biggest customer of American soy farmers as well. And for more on the implications of the truce, Otelia and I are joined by Wang. He is Chief Investment Officer, Wealth Management at UOB Kay Hian. He's speaking to us live from Hong Kong. Wang, good to have you on the show as always. Can the extension be seen as Washington's reluctance to reignite the fierce trade conflict with Beijing, or can it be seen as a win for China in response to U.S. tariffs?
Well, I think it's still too early to call a win for anybody. And it's hard to say who has the upper hand at this point. Definitely both sides have a lot at stake, and this is going to be a very big deal if it gets done. So we're continue to watch the development here, and I just don't think anyone has an advantage here. Both sides have a lot of bargaining chips on the table now.
So, given a lack of clarity on the negotiations so far, what do you think a possible trade deal might look like?
Yeah, so, based on announcements, the deals that Trump had made with other countries, there's a very interesting pattern of these boilerplates where the country will be required to pay X percentage of tariffs, buy X billion dollars of U.S. goods, and number three will be investing X trillion dollars in the U.S. as investment. But I don't think that's enough for China. China will be a special case. I think, what President Trump wanted, and he said on record, is wanting China to open the markets. And as you know, during the Stockholm negotiation just weeks ago, there was a U.S. delegate of corporates going to China to meet with high-ranking officials. I think also in the spirit of trying to open up China's market. So this deal, I don't think it's going to be a typical trade deal like in 2018 or the previous trade war. I think it would be more fundamental and more about how China can open up the markets to U.S. companies. But this is going to be tough because it will involve the core interests of China. And the second issue is the domestic market in China already face intense competition. Thus, we have a so-called anti-evolution campaign in China to reduce the competition. So if introducing more U.S. players into Chinese market will worsen the situation. So it's not something China wants at this point. So I think they're stuck.
So this trade deal is going to be unprecedented, as you say. We're already seeing unprecedented moves in terms of fees for exports. I mean, Trump allowing Nvidia, AMD to export more advanced chips to China in exchange for a fee. Can this be viewed as Washington's relenting, or rather getting anxious to cut a deal?
Yeah, last couple of months, you definitely see the U.S. Softening the stance, and not just this Nvidia deal, there are many other signals that President Trump is anxious for a deal because he closed a lot of deals with many countries already, and China is one of the last countries on his to-do list. Yes, you can see this view this as a sign of goodwill, allowing Nvidia to export H21 to China. But you notice on the same day, Beijing reiterated that, maybe we don't want the Nvidia chips because saying that it's not energy efficient, as some backdoors and possibly not safe for China. So it's not taken well by China for sure. But it does show that, like I said, the U.S. is softening. And then back to my point earlier that, Trump is pro-business. So by allowing Nvidia to sell into China, he is helping Nvidia to do more business. And consistent with what I said earlier is eventually wanting to opening up more markets in China for U.S. companies.
Also, Wang, Beijing has this trump card, we know, which is access to rare earth. Do you see it once again being used to squeeze Washington?
Yeah, rare earth is one of the chips on the bargaining table, definitely, I mentioned earlier. And there could be many of these things that being discussed that we either know or don't know about. And China is already taking a more relaxed stance on that. This will continue to be a focus of the negotiation, along with the tech sanction you mentioned earlier, along with the tariffs, along with opening of the markets in China, and maybe even including possible investments by Chinese companies into U.S. markets. And also, don't forget, China is still a big holder of U.S. treasuries. So I'm sure that also will be part of the deal.
In the meantime, though, we are talking about status quo for another 90 days. Surely this must be making it hard for investors, both in the U.S. and China, to actually make long-term plans. Tell us about some of the long-term implications, really, of the U.S. trade tariffs between these two economies for right now.
Before I talk about long-term, I do expect the negotiation to drag on. I said this a month ago, that the 90-day will be extended, and now another 90-day. This will drag on because this is China's strategy now. As you mentioned, Trump is more anxious for a deal, and China's strategy is to wait it out as long as it can until the midterm election. The midterm election is next year, but it will start late 2025. So I think time is probably on China's side. And China may have a small advantage because China is more prepared this time around, and Trump only got 3 or 4 years to go. Having said that, if there's a deal over the next few months, the long-term impact remains very uncertain. And you can just follow the Fed's rhetoric on this, even though we have not seen a inflation impact from tariffs so far. I think the U.S. Fed is very concerned about that. And we are also concerned about a possible dent to the U.S. consumer confidence if tariffs cause some kind of disruption or some kind of inflation that will eventually lead to a recession in the U.S. So long story short, long term, very uncertain, but the risk of higher inflation and lower growth are definitely there.
Okay, Chi Wang, very good for you. Thank you very much for your insights. That was Chi Wang, Chief Investment Officer, Wealth Management at UOB Kay Hian. And coming up on East Asia Tonight, Nvidia finds itself at the receiving end of the US-China chip rivalry once again. And HSBC sound caution on almost 3/4 of its Hong Kong commercial property loans. Welcome back to East Asia Tonight. Time for more business news. Japan's key indices notched up all-time highs in intraday trading as concerns over U.S. tariffs ease, driving investor sentiment. The Nikkei and the Topics paired some of those gains but ended the trading day on a high. The Nikkei 225 is currently up 2.15% for the day. The broader Topics index 1.4%. Now, the Nikkei edged close to the 43,000 mark during the morning trading session as investors returned from a long weekend, pouring into tech stocks and news that U.S. President Trump extended a tariff truce with China till November. SoftBank leading the charge, ending the day nearly 7% higher. The group is almost 30% up over the past 5 days alone, and comes as reports that it is looking to partner banks to list its payments app in the US. China is reportedly discouraging companies from using Nvidia's H20 chips. It's the latest twist for the American chipmaker, which was recently allowed to resume exports of the chip to China. Bloomberg reports that authorities have sent letters to companies asking if their purchases of the H20 chips were necessary over domestic alternatives and if they found any security issues. Last week, Chinese state media called on Nvidia to prove that its chips are secure. It came after Nvidia's representatives were summoned to explain the potential security risks of the chips, with authorities citing U.S. lawmakers' comments on embedding tracking capabilities in advanced chip exports. Nvidia says that its H20 chip is not meant for military or government use, adding that China will never rely on American chips for its government operations. China's leading semiconductor foundry, SMIC, rising on the news, ending the day more than 5% up in Hong Kong. In the US, Donald Trump has signaled he might allow Nvidia to sell more advanced AI chips to China despite ongoing national security concerns.
Do you know what the Blackwell is? The Blackwell is super duper advanced. I wouldn't make a deal with that, although it's possible I'd make a deal a somewhat enhanced in a negative way.
This comes after the US president confirmed an unprecedented revenue sharing arrangement with Nvidia and AMD. Under that deal, the chip makers would give 15% of revenue from sales in China in order to secure export licenses. The arrangement has raised alarm bells among experts for its trade, legal, and national security implications. Now, for one, a revenue for exports deal might be deemed as an export tax and opens the arrangement for a constitutional challenge. The deal is also feared to set a dangerous business precedent where future trade approvals are tied to government revenue. Looking at chip stocks in Asia, with Nvidia and AMD trying to ramp up sales in China. Well, top chip maker in Korea, SK Hynix, up 0.75% for the day. Rival Samsung Electronics up 0.14%. Both supply Nvidia with memory chips. A Japanese semiconductor testing equipment maker Advantest up more than 6.3%. And Japan's top chip maker, Tokyo Electron, up more than 1% for the day. Hong Kong's biggest lender, HSBC, says that almost 3/4 of its commercial property loans are under stress. As at the end of June, HSBC held nearly $32 billion of commercial property loans in the territory, of which more than $18 billion were classified as having a significant increase in credit risk. Now, that's nearly 2.5 times more than a year ago, while more than $5 billion displaying evidence of impairment, up nearly 60% from the same time period. The notice by HSBC comes as Hong Kong's commercial property market suffers from a prolonged slump, as analysts say that the territory's prime office rents are down more than a fifth since 2022, with nearly a fifth of office space vacant. The city's wider real estate market has been under increasing stress, with big developers writing down their portfolios. In June, one of Hong Kong's biggest builder received a lifeline of more than $11 billion as it brinked on default. And that's all for business news. And coming up on East Asia Tonight with Oteli Edwards. The South Korean president will head to Washington for his first summit with Donald Trump later this month. And torrential rains drenching Japan's Kyushu region. Authorities warn of flash floods and landslides as the deluge disrupts holiday travel.
Hello there, this is East Asia Tonight, and here are the headlines we've been following. US and China extend the trade truce by another 90 days, giving themselves until November to work out differences over duties. Japan braces for more heavy rain across vast swathes of the country, while Taiwan evacuates hundreds as Typhoon Podul barrels towards the island. South Korea awaits the ruling on prosecutors' request to arrest former First Lady Kim Kyung-hee over charges that range from stock fraud to bribery and illegal influence peddling. However proved, it will mark the first time in the country's history both a president and First Lady have been arrested. Kim Kyung-hee appeared in court today for a 5-hour hearing and left to await the ruling at a detention center in Seoul. The charges against her against her range from stock fraud to bribery and illegal influence peddling, which are punishable by years in prison. The prosecution seeking her arrest cite the risk of Kim destroying evidence and interfering with investigations. The court is expected to announce its decision soon. Her husband, former President Yoon Suk-yeol, is in jail. He is on trial on charges of insurrection after his short-lived martial law bid last December, which sees him facing life imprisonment or the death penalty. South Korean President Lee Jae-myung and U.S. President Donald Trump will hold their first summit later this month in Washington.
이번 회담은 한미 정상 간 첫 대면으로 두 정상은 변화하는 국제 안보 및 경제 환경에 대응하여 한미 동맹을 미래형 포괄적 전략 동맹으로 발전시켜 나가기 위한 방안을 논의할 예정입니다.
South Korea's presidential office said that Mr. Lee will be in Washington on the 25th of August to discuss strengthening of their bilateral alliance. The South Korean president has made it a top priority to manage the changes in the global trading environment triggered by Trump's tariff policies. Now, Mr. Trump had announced the countries had reached a trade deal that would subject South Korean goods to 15% import duties. The U.S. president added that Seoul had committed to making $350 billion of investments to be selected by him. Defense costs are expected to emerge as a key issue during the upcoming summit. North Korea has carried out artillery firing drills to boost its combat readiness. The exercises come just days before the U.S. and South Korea launch their annual joint military exercises. The state media KCNA says North Korea's tactical artillery subunits staged a firing practice contest yesterday. The drills, said to be aimed at perfecting war-fighting capabilities, are part of Pyongyang's regular summertime military exercises. Officials in Seoul say they were not large-scale, noting the absence of North Korean leader Kim Jong-un and limited weapons used. Seoul adding that Pyongyang appears to have publicly disclosed the exercise in direct response to the upcoming U.S.-South Korea military drills. Now, those exercises, called the Ulchi Freedom Shield, will run from the 18th to the 28th of August. Around 18,000 South Korean troops and several thousand American personnel will be involved. But half of the field training has been postponed until next month, with authorities pointing to heat waves as a reason. Observers say the delay may be aimed at avoiding further tensions with Pyongyang. North Korea has labeled the drills a direct military provocation and warned of a resolute counteraction. A Chinese government agency has pledged some $650 million for the Pacific island nation of Nauru as major powers vie for influence in the region. Well, the initiative, which Nauru described as a socio-economic development project, covers development in a whole range of areas, such as renewable energy, sea infrastructure, agriculture systems, and green transport systems. Officials believe the projects could boost employment opportunities on the island, as well as bilateral trade. Nauru is a small island with a population of just 12,000 people. It only has a total land area of 21 square kilometers. Historically, it has been reliant on proceeds from its phosphate mining. But with reserves dwindling, it has been looking for avenues to boost its economy. Now, China's deal with Nauru appears to have come around the same time when America is making a $60 million pledge to the Pacific Islands region. A U.S. State Department official on Monday stressed that the Trump administration would release the long-promised funds. Australia as well is moving ahead with its own plan. On Wednesday, senior officials will hold talks in Vanuatu with a deal for infrastructure and economic development worth more than $320 million under consideration. Now, the announcements all coming ahead of the region's top political meeting next month. Solomon Islands, the host of the annual meeting, has blocked 21 donor countries, including China and the U.S., from attending in a surprise move following pressure from Beijing to exclude Taiwan. Now, Manila has expressed concern over what it described as dangerous maneuvers and unlawful interference by Chinese vessels in the South China Sea. The Philippine Coast Guard released this video on Monday, showing a Chinese Coast Guard vessel colliding with another Chinese warship while they were chasing a Philippine Coast Guard ship near the contested Scarborough Shoal in the South China Sea. Manila says the actions posed a grave danger to Philippine personnel and vessels. Now, a Chinese Coast Guard spokesperson confirmed yesterday that a confrontation did take place, but did not mention the collision. He added that they had taken necessary measures, such as blocking and controlling the Philippine vessels to drive Philippine vessels away. All right, now time for some headlines from media outlets in East Asia. Taipei Times saying that a fishing boat caught fire at a fishing port in Taiwan's Keelung overnight, sending thick black smoke high into the night sky. All 6 crew members jumped into the sea and none were injured. While China's Daily says a Shenzhou 20 crew on board China's orbiting Tiangong space station have completed several tasks in recent days. That includes unpacking and testing 2 new spacewalk suits. Yonhap reports that Golden, a track from animated U.S. film K-pop Demon Hunters, has reached #1 on Billboard's Hot 100 main singles chart. The song is the 9th associated with K-pop to conquer the Hot 100 and the first by female vocalists. More regions across Japan are bracing for torrential rain after parts of the southern island of Kyushu saw record downpours. Well, the Met Agency says vast areas from west to northern Japan could experience heavy rainfall through Wednesday. Northern areas of Kyushu, along with the Chongoku and Hokuriku regions that are the areas highlighted, are at increased risk of disasters such as flooding and landslides. While rain's not exactly letting up in southwestern Kyushu, broadcaster NHK says that at least 1 death has been confirmed after a house was struck by a mudslide. The search teams are also looking for 2 people swept away by a fast-moving river in a Fukuoka suburb. Several more are said to be missing. The highest alert remains for Kumamoto Prefecture, where rainfall exceeded 40 centimeters over a 24-hour span. Authorities say nearly 700 homes have been inundated by floodwaters. Millions have earlier been told to evacuate, as maximum caution was urged against flash floods and landslides. Elsewhere, authorities in Taiwan are racing to evacuate hundreds of people in the likely path of Typhoon Podul as the storm barrels toward the island's southeast. Now, a land warning is now in place for Hualien, Taitung, Pingtung, and Kaohsiung, as these areas will likely bear the brunt of the storm in the coming days. Podul's packing winds of up to 155 kilometers per hour and is expected to sweep across Taiwan's densely populated west coast before heading towards China's Fujian province later this week. Now, over in Hualien, nearly 700 residents are being evacuated over fears that a natural dam could overflow. Earlier, authorities issued a sea warning, alerting coastal areas in view of possible dangerous conditions and destructive waves. Fishermen have been told to bring the boats back to port.
影響生計啊啦，無影響，無出工活落來領薪水啊。但是安全第一啦，趁錢久長的啦。
Meanwhile, China's Fujian province is getting ready for the typhoon's arrival. Authorities are inspecting vessels and advising passenger ferries to prepare for service suspensions. Offshore construction projects along the coast have also been halted, with construction vessels moved to safe harbor. An earthquake has struck the eastern Indonesian region of Papua. Preliminary assessments show the magnitude was in the range of 6.1 and 6.5. The epicenter is just off the north coast of the West Papua region at a depth of about 13 kilometers. The Pacific Tsunami Warning Center said that there was no threat of a tsunami. There has been no damage or casualties reported so far. Families of victims of the 1985 Japan Airlines Flight 123 crash are commemorating the 40th anniversary of the tragedy today. The jumbo jet was en route from Tokyo to Osaka when it went down 45 minutes into its flight, leaving just 4 survivors out of the 524 people on board. A memorial ceremony began at the Ueno village in Gunma Prefecture earlier at 6:56 p.m. local time, the exact moment the plane impacted a mountain ridge nearby 4 decades ago. Her relatives have been making a yearly pilgrimage to the remote crash site to pray for the victims. Many of them were traveling to their hometowns for the Bond summer holiday season. Now, the official investigation report released 2 years after the crash blamed the incident on faulty repairs, which led to the rupturing of the plane's rear pressure bulkhead and destroyed critical parts of the aircraft that needs to stay in the air. Now, in the years since, Japan Airlines has ramped up safety efforts, with the newly hired employees required to visit the crash site and again at certain points in their careers. Our break's up next, but coming up on East Asia tonight, the Malaysian Prime Minister calls for stronger ties with Bangladesh as he welcomes interim leader Muhammad Yunus in Putrajaya. And Singapore sends more humanitarian aid to support urgent relief efforts in Gaza. It's the 9th tranche since the Israel-Hamas war started. U.S. President Donald Trump has praised Intel CEO Lip-Bu Tan just days after publicly calling for his resignation. Well, the American leader says his cabinet and the Intel CEO will have suggestions for him next week.
U.S. President Donald Trump said he met with Intel CEO Lip-Bu Tan on Monday, praising him and calling the meeting a very interesting one. That's a reversal days after Trump publicly called for Tan to resign, claiming he was highly conflicted over ties to Chinese firms, raising doubts about Tan's plans to turn around the struggling American chip icon. In a post on Truth Social Monday, Trump said he met with Tan, Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick, and Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent. In the post, Trump also said his cabinet members and Tan were going to bring suggestions to him next week. He added that Tan's success and rise is an amazing story. According to Reuters reporting in April, Tan had invested in hundreds of Chinese firms. Some of those were linked to the Chinese military. It is not illegal for U.S. citizens to hold stakes in Chinese companies unless the firms have been explicitly banned on a U.S. Treasury list. An Intel statement Monday said Tan met with Trump for a candid and constructive discussion on the company's commitment to strengthening U.S. technology and manufacturing leadership. It also said the firm would work closely with the administration to restore this great American company.
Singapore is to continue to work with regional partners to support urgent relief efforts in Gaza. The country has sent its 9th tranche of humanitarian aid since the Israel-Hamas war began in 2023. Contributions now exceed 22 million Singapore dollars. 58 defense personnel are involved in this latest operation, which is Singapore's second airdrop mission. Aslam Shah witnessed their departure this morning.
In the quiet hours before dawn, Singapore's stated commitment to help those in need is preparing to take flight. Packed aboard are vital medical supplies and food aid, contributions from Singaporeans through various non-governmental organizations and the Health Ministry. Representatives from these groups and government officials joined the send-off ceremony, united in their resolve to ease the suffering of the people in Gaza.
Even though we may have little control about what happens in Gaza, but we have a lot of control what we can do together. I want to urge each and every one of us to continue to pray for peace, safety, and dignity for the people of Gaza.
MINDEF remains deeply concerned with the dire humanitarian situations in Gaza. Singapore calls for the immediate ceasefire, the release of all hostages without conditions, and the lifting of all restrictions on humanitarian assistance and aid into Gaza.
Now the C-130 is just powering up, and this aircraft is capable of carrying over 20,000 kilograms of aid, and in just minutes it will head down this runway and travel over 7,000 kilometers towards Jordan. It will then help in the airdrops of supplies to Gaza, where ground access is heavily restricted. This operation is conducted at the invitation of the Jordanian government. And off it goes, carrying not just supplies, but what the Singapore government says is the compassion of the country and its people, with wishes for peace and some much-needed relief in Gaza.
Malaysian Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim has called for the strengthening of bilateral ties between his nation and Bangladesh during a joint press conference with Bangladesh Chief Advisor Muhammad Yunus. Now, Mr. Yunus is in Malaysia for a 3-day working visit. Now, Mr. Anwar raised concerns of the burden placed on Dhaka in having to cater to Rohingya refugees amid the crisis in neighbouring Myanmar. They also talked trade and investment, labour cooperation, tourism and defence. Mr. Anwar and Mr. Yunus witnessed the signing of several MOUs in these areas. The Bangladeshi interim leader had sought Mr. Anwar's support in July for his nation to join ASEAN, which Malaysia currently chairs. And CNA's Afifa Arfin has more on these talks.
Well, both leaders had described today's meeting as warm and productive, with Malaysian Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim calling Bangladesh's chief advisor, Dr. Muhammad Yunus, a great friend of Malaysia and placing Bangladesh as an important partner for investment, culture, trade and education. They both discussed expanding cooperation in areas such as technology, skills training, strategic studies, as well as semiconductor capacity building. And they also reaffirmed the strong people-to-people ties, particularly the role of Bangladeshi workers in Malaysia. Dr. Yunus, who described Malaysia as a second home, had thanked Kuala Lumpur for hosting Bangladeshi workers, saying that many of them return back home with the skills to start businesses. He credited PM Anwar as well for offering support during Bangladeshi's political transition last year, when his interim government came into power after mass protests. Now, he says that Bangladesh is open for business and is actively seeking Malaysian investment to build a high-growth, sustainable economy.
Sri Lanka's stocks closed near the flat line in today's session, but the market has been one of the world's best performers, soaring nearly 50% last year and still climbing in 2025. Roland Lim spoke to Rajeeva Bandaranaike earlier, the CEO of the Colombo Stock Exchange, who tells us what is driving the growth behind the country's bourse.
It's a sustainable growth that the market has experienced on the back of reform in the country. As you know, we have gone through multiple crises in the past in Sri Lanka for the last 6 or 7 years, and we're just coming out of an economic crisis as well. And all the economic numbers are positive numbers. You look at GDP growth from a negative to a positive. You have a low interest rate regime. You have a stable currency. We are on an IMF program. The debt restructuring has been successful. And on the back of it, we have also got political stability. So all these ingredients have come together at one time. And I think that is driving positive investor sentiment. And as a result, we have seen strong domestic interest among domestic investors into the stock market. And that has fueled a lot of demand. And then we have seen this surge in pricing. I think another major factor would be the low interest rate regime, that investors are shifting their portfolios from debt to equity. And we have, as a result, seen more new investors coming in, younger investors joining in, and also we have seen greater demand for equities. And I think this is driving the surge in the equity market right now. Apart from the economic factors, there's also a lot of policy reform that is also happening in Sri Lanka. A lot of legislative changes, new acts being passed, for example, the Public Debt Management Act and the debt restructuring. So those are also having a lot of impact on the confidence of investors that they invest in equities. I think a combination of those factors have been driving the market in recent times.
These series of Invest Sri Lanka roadshows, you've done many of these, and you're promoting the fact that there is economic recovery in Sri Lanka. How have efforts been in terms of trying to attract more foreign investments? Have you actually seen more interests in the Sri Lankan markets again?
Yeah, so foreign investors have been a mainstay in our market for a very long time. I think pre-pandemic, about 30-35% of our volumes were driven by foreign investors, mostly from the West, from the US, from Europe, UK, etc. And we have seen investment allocations made of Singapore and even countries like Australia as well. So we have seen sustained foreign investment into the country. About 22% of our portfolio in equities are foreign held anyway. So foreigners have been quite strong in investing in Sri Lanka. So the Invest Sri Lanka forums itself has given us a very good platform to communicate the developments in the market, developments in the country. So in these forums, like for example, what we're having in Singapore, we bring together policymakers, representatives from the government, a minister in charge, the central bank governor, then we bring the regulator, the exchange, stockbrokers, we bring listed companies in, we have one-to-one meetings between listed companies and fund managers. So we create an entire platform to communicate the story that we have about Sri Lanka, the growth potential. And this has provided us a very good opportunity to, as a means of communicating and marketing the stock market as well as Sri Lanka. And we have this Invest Sri Lanka forums regularly. Of course, we're coming back to Singapore after 7 years.
So say if I am a foreign investor and I want exposure in ASEAN, why should I choose Sri Lankan stocks?
Right now, it's valuations. Comparative to our peer markets, Sri Lanka is relatively cheap. Our P's are at 8 to 9 times on book, and that makes it attractive in compared to the rest of the markets in region. And on the back of a lot of potential developments in Sri Lanka as well. So I think we are on the threshold of being re-rated, the sovereign rating, etc., which we're probably expecting next year. So we are on the threshold of further movement, and as a result, that makes it attractive for foreign investors, both domestic and foreign investors, to enter into equities.
What about concerns like currency risks, market liquidity, or even policy stability?
Yeah, so as I explained, I think there is a lot of reform going on within the country, and there is policy level sustainability and consistency in certain legislative changes that are brought about, which gives confidence to investors that the political stability that has been established. We have a new president in place, a 5-year term. We have a majority in parliament, 2/3 majority in parliament, which gives the political stability and for the reform process also to continue. And on the back of that, the economic numbers that I spoke about, the indicators, the relatively low interest rate regime that has been established will provide and the low inflation. The low inflation rates also will provide the basis for a stable interest rate regime and a stable currency as well, which probably is having the impact on the market right now.
And time to wrap up Tuesday's edition of East Asia Tonight. Don't forget your headlines anytime at CNA.Asia, and you can always find us on Facebook and YouTube. Thanks for watching.